And we are ready to begin.
We are, thanks.
Heavenly Father, creator of all, we give thanks for this day, and we give thanks for the work that we are about to do. Today is one of joyous reconciliation, to be able to speak of things unheard of. We welcome each and every one of you to the traditional territory of the Northern Coast Salish people. And we ask that you help each and every one of us to have an open heart and an open mind as we deliberate today. Allah Kesla, Amen. Welcome, everyone. And I hope we do well today and we have a great discussion. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Oglilogwa, Kim Rakalma Kludazi, for that very warm welcome. My name is Chloe Straw. I'm the program coordinator of the Islands Trust Stewardship Education Program, and I'm so pleased to be with you this evening. I want to thank each of you for joining us as we launch this year's Stewardship Education webinar. So excited to be featuring this very important project in our first webinar of the year. And thank you for joining us to learn about this initiative, the Xwe'etay Lasqueti Archaeology Project, which brings the island settler community of Lasqueti Island together with the Colquhoun, Tla'amin, Comox, Xwe'etay, and Halalt nations. I'm especially grateful to our speakers this evening for the powerful work that they're doing in community, as well as at the University of Simon Fraser, and for taking the time to share with us about it tonight. So you're in for a real treat. Thank you for joining us. I'll just go over a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get on with the show. Due to the large number of attendees this evening, we do have over 140 people registered to attend the webinar, which is so wonderful. We are going to just keep it for presenters will be speaking tonight. So if you notice that your microphone is automatically muted, that is the kind of default setting just to make sure that we can really hear the presenters very clearly. That said, we very much do want to hear from you with your questions and comments. So please use the chat function that you should see at the bottom of your screen to type in your questions or comments there. Myself and my colleague Morgana, who's supporting us behind the scenes tonight, will be monitoring the chat very closely and getting those questions ready to ask our panel when we get to that portion of the evening. We're also recording the webinar tonight so that we can make it available on our Stewardship Education webpage. For those of you who may want to watch it again, I think there's going to be some really rich learnings, and we may want to have a second viewing. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Dr. Dana Lipovsky. Dana is a professor of archaeology at Simon Fraser University. She conducts archaeological and ethno-ecological research that spans disciplines and communities and situates the knowledge and experience of the past in current social and ecological contexts. Her work involves working with and learning from Indigenous communities of the Pacific Northwest. And there's no doubt that Dana is committed to bringing together settler and Indigenous populations to promote Indigenous heritage conservation and respect. And really excited to hear from Dana, who's going to give us a bit of an overview of the project. Over to you, Dana.
Well, thank you so much to all of you who have joined, and to Chloe and Morgana for all the organizing you've done. I'm just going to share my screen right off so you have something pretty to look at. And there we go. So just a little more housekeeping before we launch in, just to tell you that I'm going to kick off the evening as the archaeologist. I'm the one who likes to play in the dirt on the team. And then I'm going to turn it over to my partner in crime, Sean Markey, who covers the policy and planning end of it. And a little bit back to me to do a little more outreach, and then over to Kim Rakalma-Clutisi, our project matriarch, leader, teacher, and dear friend. And so we'll do a little bit of bouncing back and forth, but that's really what this project is all about, is about sharing knowledge across communities. So I'm very excited to be talking about this project with you tonight. It's obviously very near and dear to my heart. I actually am calling in from Xwe'etay, or Lasqueti Island, where I live and I work, which is mostly just an extraordinary privilege. I said mostly because sometimes it's really hard to do this kind of work and social justice work in the community where you live, but it's also, well, the privilege is really deep. To first of all be an archaeologist and be able to, call it my profession, that I get to explore the deep time history and heritage and its connections to today of Indigenous people, and again to do it in a place that I also feel connected to. Extraordinary. So the Xwe'etay Lasqueti Archaeology Project is, or XLAP as I'll probably fall into calling it, is a project that came together with, as the title says, goal to figure out ways that we could honor and protect Indigenous heritage, and kind of use archaeology, if you will, to bring communities together as a way of starting conversations across communities. So settler to settler, settler to Indigenous, Indigenous to Indigenous. And XLAP is a little bit different than a lot of other archaeological endeavors. For one, that it incorporates policy and planning, so kind of a top-down kind of change, social change and social justice kind of perspective, but also a community-based perspective, a bottom-up perspective. But in doing that, we're also really interested in not just bringing those two views together, but also bringing all these communities together, as I said, settler and Indigenous and all that. Because many archaeology projects have the privilege of just working with Indigenous communities, and you take all your leadership, all the direction from the Indigenous community, and it's easier, I can tell you that, than working squarely in private property in settler occupied land. But we all know that the colonial structures are what run the show. And in my mind, unless we bring settlers fully into the conversation, we're not going to be able to dismantle and shake up and disrupt that system and hopefully settle on something better. So that's what this project is all about. It's meant to be inclusive and hear multiple voices. Just a moment to talk about we talked about honoring and protecting Indigenous heritage or Indigenous cultural heritage. I'm a little bit embarrassed to even have this slide with Kimmy here, but it's just by way of setting the stage, and Kim will of course add a lot more depth to this. But the point that I really want to make with this slide is that the thing about Indigenous heritage is that it's place-based, it's multi-generational, it's passed on through memories, stories, songs, and it's just inseparably connected to people's identity. And so it cannot be one size fits all. It's got to be place specific. You need to work in community. You need to work from the bottom up to figure out how that heritage is expressed today and in the past. So the archaeological record is just one of the many ways that Indigenous heritage can be seen, known, understood, felt, touched. But there are many other ways, of course, but it is a good access point. The other thing that's important to recognize in this conversation is that Indigenous heritage is protected legally through the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, so at the Canada-wide level, DRIPA, the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People Act at the BC level. So it's mandated that Indigenous heritage be protected, that Indigenous people have the right to practice their Indigenous heritage. All that is so important to recognize, and I hope someday we achieve the lofty goals that are in those documents. But I think it's also important to remember it's just the right thing to do. It's just the right thing to be respectful of each other's heritage. And that is, again, another foundational principle of our project. And so I rarely talk about DRIPA and UNDRIP with the communities I work with, the settler community, but really talk about again, the right thing to do, about what's ethical. So Sean and I get to be the cheerleaders, if you will, of a fabulous, as I said, multi-community, multidisciplinary team. We have policy and planners who have guided us from inside academia, from SFU and elsewhere, outside in the municipalities, archaeologists, of course, various representatives from the settler community here on Xwe'etay, and of course are just unbelievably valued and trusted Indigenous collaborators and mentors and guides to all this. So we are a big team, and we're just actually, all of us, I would say everybody in this photograph feels very, very fortunate to be part of this endeavor. It's been really quite something. So why Lasqueti? Well, you know, we could have worked anywhere except that I work here, so I put votes in to work on Xwe'etay, of course, so it's nice to roll out of bed and get to work. But really the issues that we're going to be talking about that are happening here on Xwe'etay are happening elsewhere in other Gulf Islands, elsewhere in BC, really elsewhere in the world. There's lots of development going on. Heritage is being lost rapidly. We have a little bit of knowledge from the archaeology of the surveys that were done in the 70s. They're good, but they're not perfect, so they're limited in what we can infer from them. And also we see the mix of, you know, people are fearful of Indigenous rights. What does it mean? It's going to take away my private property, take away my history. But also the flip side is they're excited about archaeology. And again, we use that archaeology, that cool factor that we'll be talking about, to draw people together. That I think that with capitalizing, if you will, on the excitement piece, the fear diminishes. And we have data to show that. As I said, I live on Xwe'etay, and I've been doing kind of outreach with the community here for 30 years. When I got here, the trope was that Indigenous people only came here to gather occasionally, to fish, to hunt, but they definitely didn't live here. When all around me I saw evidence of permanent settlement, and we'll talk more about that in a second. And I think that truth has been turned around. There are 14 nations with historical connections to Xwe'etay, and Kim can talk more about that. Different nations have different kinds of connections, and the depth and the breadth of it varies. But it makes for a complicated, or complex, I should say, kind of social framework for an outsider like me. Something that's unique maybe to Lasqueti, not so unique, there are other places as well. There's no building permits, so there's no trigger for automatically triggering the Heritage Conservation Act. But as we know, development happens all over the province, even where building permits are allowed without building permits. And so that there's an automatic trigger, which Sean will talk about more about, kind of that when you get a building permit, some kind of archaeological process should happen. There's no building permits here, so it doesn't happen. So really, we need to rely on people's goodwill. Because I've lived here for so long, I know who the landowners are who are living on the sites. And a big piece of this puzzle in my mind is, again, bringing settlers in, especially the settlers who have private property on which archaeological sites sit. And those people can be afraid or can just totally embrace the project. And so we see all kinds of variations on that. So yeah, that's a little bit about Lasqueti. A little more about Lasqueti is, I tell my students that anywhere you work is going to be cool archaeology. That's kind of standard. You just need to have the right kind of research approach. I actually didn't know that Lasqueti was going to be that cool from an archaeological perspective. I just, in hindsight, it's so clear. So if you look at where we are, we're right in the middle of the Salish Sea. And if you think about this is the highway. People are going up and down the Salish Sea in canoes. They have to go by Xwe'etay. So it is situated in the center of the Salish Sea. And we say it's in the middle of everywhere, unlike the kind of view today where people, it's in the middle of nowhere because it's hard to get to, it's off grid, you have to take a passenger ferry. And settlers have been coming to Lasqueti and living here for the last 100 years thinking they were getting away from the trappings of, the rest of the world. But it's very, very different. But that view of it being in the middle of nowhere is partly what I want to say, influenced how the settler community understood Indigenous presence here, because they thought it's so remote, and why would anyone live here? Well, they are, I am, we are, and it's not, and it's anything but remote in when you're in the middle of the waterway. The other thing to understand about Lasqueti is that although it's small, it's only about 20 kilometers long, the whole coastline is just full of these little bays and inlets. And if you actually measure the coastline, it's actually got more coastline than nearby Xwe'etay, which has got 4 times more area than Lasqueti. So it's because there's so many little places to live on Lasqueti, and they're protected places. And furthermore, as we'll talk about later, critically important for inter-kin connection on Xwe'etay is that those bays are walkable. So even in a southeaster, when it's blowing out, you can get to your neighbor. And if you're Coast Salish, connecting to your kin is really important. So take Xwe'etay again. It doesn't have those bays, and much of the coastline is quite steep, so you can't get from one bay to another in a southeaster. And there's a big kind of mountain in the middle, so you can't go up, hoof it up and over. So it's a really great place to live, and it's really not surprising that there were so many people living here in the past. And giving you kind of a punchline ahead of the game is like looking at the end of a spy novel. Based on our work, we estimate that a minimum of 800 Indigenous people and upwards of maybe a couple thousand people lived here at this peak time, because there are so many places for people to live, and because of where it is geographically. So I mentioned that when I came here, and this is, again, not uncommon, again, Lasqueti being representative of other places, this idea that Indigenous people weren't here and Indigenous history was erased. And there's lots of reasons why that would happen, from the diseases, from people being removed forcibly to residential schools, from development, destroying archaeological sites. And so people looked at the landscape today and thought, where's the Indigenous history? I don't see it. And that's where archaeologists, I think, have really missed the boat, and that we need to be teaching people how to see the deep past through archaeological eyes. Because as Kim says, it's hiding in plain sight. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. There's this great quote from an elder, a Cowichan elder, referring to False Bay, which is where the ferry comes in today, and what's pictured on these pictures down below, from about 1860, as far as I can figure. So before the last smallpox epidemic, saying that there were people all around. Like False Bay was a packed place, and based on the archaeological record, I can tell you that that's very true. This is or was a huge settlement site where these buildings are today. So, fair enough. You look at that and say, where's the Indigenous past? So it's our job to actually show people. And once you show them, as I said, you can't unsee it. We did a survey of the entire coast, all that coastline, by boat and by walking. And we went on to people's property who allowed us to come on and dig these, put in these cores, these percussion cores that produce these tubes that you see over on the right here. And then it gives you a nice kind of detailed stratigraphic layering of what's in the ground without having to dig a hole. So it's a very low impact way of being able to get charcoal from the very, very bottom of the tube. You can say, how old is this thing? And you can put them on the edges and say, how big is this thing? And then we can start mapping settlements. This is my friend Christine Roberts from Xwe'etay excavating a clam garden with me. And down at the lower left here, you can see that's myself and my student Vlad Krakoff, who has this high precision GPS backpack on. And that's how we actually figure out where all the sites are. So we have very detailed data now on how old these sites are and where they are. And really, that's the best way to counter this idea that Indigenous people aren't here. It was a little bit harder to show continuity of settlement because the upper cores of those plastic tubes are often disturbed by, modern houses. So we had to look for other ways to talk about what was the Indigenous presence in the historic time, that is after European contact in the 1800s. And we find that all over the island there are these Douglas fir trees, gorgeous Douglas fir trees, that have had their bark removed, slabs removed for high intensity fires. And even though they were actually removed with metal tools, This is a very, very indigenous thing to do. So we're able to show, based on the age of these trees, that this is probably like just after, in the early 1800s, 1860, before people were pretty much gone from the island. By 1870, there were a lot of indigenous people, even though they may not have been living in those permanent settlements anymore, because populations are reduced because of disease and the like. They were coming here a lot. But by 1870, as far as I can tell from the archives, very few people are coming, and settlers moved in. They brought hundreds of sheep, they cut down trees, and in 10 years, basically changed the landscape. So this is what some of these settlements look like archaeologically. This one on the upper left here is actually on the property where I live with my dog Willow, who's now passed, but who I love. And you can see that this is actually leaves, but you can imagine that they're shell. You're looking at shell deposits. And this flat here is not a natural flat. This is created by shell, people actually using shell as construction fill to create platforms for houses to be built on. And there are several of them in the bay near where I live. Here's another one on the upper right. You can see it's artificially flat, and that's all shell. And you can imagine that the settlers put their home on these flat, naturally flat areas. I see this up and down the coast. Nope, not so natural. You're actually sitting on 4,000 years of history. This one on the bottom is a site that we couldn't get on, and I think it's probably going to be one of the earliest sites on the island. But you can just barely see at the top of this. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but you can see there's kind of a break in slope here. If you can see where my cursor is going back and forth, that basically goes flat, then goes up and goes flat again. I think this is an enormous settlement. These flats, again, housed houses where Indigenous people lived and laughed and played. And now we just need to learn how to see these remnants. We're able to put all this information together. I just want to look at my time here. Okay, I'm good. Put all this information together and to ask, where were people really settling on the island? Where were the hot spots? And what the red and the yellow is the hottest spots, and the blue being the coolest. And these are basically reflect the density and size of settlements. And you can see that the most dense and the biggest settlements are here on the north end. And interestingly, you can see that this is only like a 15-minute walk. So even though in a southeaster, again, it'd be just crazy to get around there, you could just see your neighbor. They probably acted as one settlement. We don't know the governance structure. We don't know about the chiefly structure, but we know that these were tight-knit communities where you're constantly calling on kin, calling social relations to thrive. You can see that the dates are later here, as I think as False Bay and Maple Bay got packed, people moved out. You can also see from the blue that there are some places that were never really settled very much. They could have, but what's different about these places here, like this one that has got no settlement, if you can see just above my cursor, is in a storm you can't really go anywhere, and to walk, it's a pain in the neck. It's like an hour and a half to your nearest neighbor. So it's just if you're really interested in making those kin connections, where you want to be is up here, downtown. I call it downtown Xwe'etay. If you combine that with all the artifacts or belongings that people have shared with us, found in their gardens, you can see that these dots represent that people are everywhere on this island. And it's probably not unique for Xwe'etay. It's probably true for a lot of other places. It's just that we have the connections here and the community willingness and graciousness to share this. We know that in order to feed this very large population, people have had to have complex engineering of clam gardens, fish traps, as you can see, cultivated camas, cultivated apple trees or crabapple, huge orchard just down the road from me, enormous. I brought a crabapple expert from up north where there's a lot of cultivated crabapple, and this is indigenous crabapple, native crabapple, and they were blown away by the size of this orchard. It made me very proud. And also very far-reaching trade networks, which you don't have a lot of time to talk about, but just to show off this piece of obsidian here that comes from southeastern Idaho. Someone hoofed it all the way from southeastern Idaho on their back, then over water. These are very well-connected people. And that's how you survive in an island in the middle of everywhere for thousands of years. So really, the whole point of this, again, is to bring forward the beauty and the depth and the extent like of learning that can happen when you start exploring and embracing Indigenous history. And we could talk a lot about the many kind of outreach events that we did on Xwe'etay. We don't have time to do that tonight, but I can tell you that you draw people in on the archaeology, and conversations happen, and then friendship happens, and then reconciliation happens. Kim might want to talk more about this, but we were very honored, Kim and her family, alongside Bill White and Willie,
Willie Pierre.
yeah, thank you, is it Peters, Willie Pierre, had honored us with having a burning ceremony for the ancestors, where we were tasked with making 60 plates on which and 15 platters on which traditional foods were put, and they were offered to the ancestors. Gifts were given to the ancestors. This happened twice. We were witness to this. It's probably the first time the ceremony has happened in a couple hundred years on Xwe'etay. Probably the first time to this many non-Indigenous people, although many Indigenous people came from all around. And the ancestors said very clearly, they're happy to be remembered. Please don't forget us again. And so, how incredible. So there's no question that there's incredible amount of potential when you start like understanding archaeology and having these conversations. But the policy and the legal system in which all protection of archaeological sites is embedded is not working that well. And so then I get to turn it over to Sean to tell a little bit of the kind of bad news story. But before I do, I just want to very quickly say publicly, which I love to do, is that Sean is extraordinary in his history of working with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people and bringing policy to a level that is meaningful and creates social change. And I have learned so much from working with this man. I just cannot believe my good fortune. And so I'll let Sean introduce you some more, but I just have to say that.
Thanks very much, Dana. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure to work with Dana and Kim and the entire XLAP team on this project. My name's Sean Markey. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Environment at Simon Fraser University and also a professor in the School of Resource and Environmental Management and a registered professional planner working in that planning school. And the system that is broken that Dana was talking about, we heard over and over again over the course of the project that heritage, Indigenous cultural heritage, was being lost at the pace of development. And that is a system that is designed or supposed to be protecting Indigenous heritage, but is clearly not. So what we want to do is sort of talk about a variety of reasons and ways and why that system isn't working. But we're also going to talk about pathways forward, pathways that could hopefully take us all to a better place of understanding and respect. And it really shows the power of this project in terms of bringing it together archaeology. And I've been absolutely amazed and dazzled by the way that archaeology can bring people together, the way that Dana can bring people together, and the way that she practices archaeology. It's an extraordinarily powerful tool to have these conversations. So we joke sometimes that Dana gets to dig in the dirt and, take people on intertidal beach walks and things like that. And then I get to talk about, bylaw 17, the official community plan. It's maybe a little less engaging, but as we'll talk about, it's, the fact that we're looking at all these systems together is really important because the heritage is being lost because of land use planning and the policy that is supposed to design it and protect it. So what we thought we would do is walk through a variety of different projects that we had looking at intersection of Indigenous archaeological heritage and the planning system. It's important to understand that the core objective of policy and planning for generations has been to facilitate colonial development. That has been its primary objective. So for decades, governments have sustained this system where the policy and the planning system was designed to sort of get to yes, to facilitate colonial development, and Indigenous heritage was simply not valued and has not been valued in that process. And even further, nations and Indigenous peoples themselves have been largely cut out of that process. So while, Dana mentioned that the policy is clear, there is policy written down that says that it is illegal to disrupt and disturb an Indigenous archaeological heritage site without a proper archaeological assessment. For a variety of reasons, that's not happening or happening to the extent that it should. And it's certainly not involving nations to the extent that it should either. So let's start, Dana, maybe with the first piece, which was really designed to sort of understand this system better. What is the intersection of Indigenous archaeological heritage with the planning system? This work was conducted by Madeline McLean. There she is there. And, we see the evidence of the impacts of planning and development all around us, from individual landowner sites to larger industrial sites and development. And in that sense, the extent to which heritage has been lost links us to a concept of planning which has been described as a tool that spatializes oppression. So through domination and control and removal and erasure that Dana was talking about, Indigenous peoples have been separated from their lands and their memories. The other aspect of the system, of course, has been to separate local planners and land use planners, those that are responsible for managing the land base, from interaction and any sort of jurisdiction over the archaeological process. So the provincial governments controls the archaeology, and local governments and regional governments control the land use planning. And there's a definite mismatch in that system, which has been further exacerbated by the lack of Indigenous participation. But we also see problems in terms of the lack of recognition of non-material heritage. So very prescriptive about what counts as Indigenous heritage or not, when clearly it's a much more expansive concept, as Dana mentioned right off the outset. And again, we've really just prioritized private property rights. And while we have an incomplete inventory of Indigenous sites, Dana mentioned the work that was done in the 1970s. The project, I think, was very grateful to at least have those sites on record, and you could see it as a foundation for sort of that mind bob map of just looking at where Indigenous heritage is on the island, which is everywhere, and it sort of removes that sense of specificity, or that to some extent the fear of whether or not people have sites on their property or not, because you just come to understand that the Indigenous heritage is everywhere. So next slide. So this next piece was to really sort of understand the perspective of landowners and settler landowners. Dana mentioned how important that is within the archaeological process. The significant amounts of Indigenous archaeological heritage is being lost on private land, but our understanding of settler perspectives on Indigenous heritage, on the archaeological process, is really quite limited. This study was conducted by Owen Wilson, an SFU graduate student, who conducted interviews with Xwe'etay landowners with registered sites. And there are, guidebooks around heritage management will talk about this, but in very vague, non-specific terms, like consult with landowners. And that's that's pretty much all you get. And, what we've come to understand is that is just simply not enough. There's tremendous amounts of nuance in terms of settler perspectives, varying levels of knowledge and appreciation for the importance and understanding of Indigenous heritage. So we really have to understand settler viewpoints if we're going to engage them effectively in processes of heritage conservation. So, our findings are really oriented towards that. And what we found is that there is considerable variability in the level of knowledge about Indigenous heritage and the archaeological process from islanders. Again, this is coming from an island that has had a resident archaeologist living there for over 30 years, showing up at farmers markets and talking about Indigenous heritage. So it may be a bit of even an outlier in terms of the level of understanding that exists in sort of comparative jurisdictions. There's quite a significant amount of fear that is out there in terms of fears about land is being taken away, and fears about infringements on what people can do with their property. And there's really three things that are driving this. One is the lingering myths and doubts that Dana talked about, that settlers have been telling themselves for generations that, well, Indigenous peoples never lived here. And of course, once we expand the archaeological lens, we see that, of course, that's simply not true. There is this system of sort of regulatory control around Indigenous heritage is very opaque. and leads to quite a fairly significant amount of confusion. As Dana mentioned, in many jurisdictions, there's no sort of active development permitting process. So there's nothing that triggers that an archaeological assessment should take place in much of the land base in rural and non-metropolitan areas, which is significantly problematic. And then, of course, there's also very active misinformation, which is sort of just incorrect information that gets passed around, not maliciously or anything. But we've also very much encountered active disinformation, which is incorrect information, which is being sort of weaponized to stoke fear about what the implications of Indigenous heritage might be on your land. And you know, what we saw was that confronting that fear really took a lot of listening. It takes a tremendous amount of humility, and understanding that people are, to some degree, experiencing a sense of loss, either in their worldview or their sense of history and place on the island, to some degree their identities. And you know, through the project, we've really tried to counter that with really three things. One, which is clarity about what is Indigenous archaeological heritage or cultural heritage. Why is it important to nations? Why it is important generally? We've also realized that we have to just simply further the education that takes place on the islands all over, in terms of building that engagement and building the relationships between people, and really strive towards a sense of shared value and understanding about the depth of history and the stewardship, which landowners are now playing an active role in managing that history and hopefully engaging with nations in a better understanding of what that could look like. So out of the sort of, there's certainly encountered negativity in terms of the fear, but lots of openness to education, lots of openness to sort of local management and local processes of engaging and managing Indigenous cultural heritage. And with that, Dana, maybe we'll just sort of cover the third piece, which is really trying to understand how nations themselves are exerting their own self-determination over the management of their territory. There are ongoing processes of regulatory and act change. There's a Heritage Act transformation project that has been underway for 3 years, engaged in 3 different phases of consultation. But obviously there's a grinding process to regulatory change, and many nations are simply seeking to exert their own self-determination over their territory, defining for themselves what to better understand heritage within their territories, identify the parameters within which that heritage has to be understood through archaeological processes, and then really prioritizing different areas of management control. So we partnered with the Comox First Nation, and huge thanks to the archaeologists and the counselors and the entire nation for working with us to better understand that process. In 2020, they launched their heritage policy and an accompanying sort of planning tool, which is the Cultural Heritage Investigation Permit, or CHIP, which is the archaeological permit given out by the nation in order to facilitate development on the land. We encountered, and they are encountering, the traditional barriers of provincial control over the archaeological process, lack of jurisdiction of local and regional governments to manage that. But what this CHIP process has done through processes of regional relationship building has really provided a way for nations to have much more control over their heritage management in their territories. And the good news story that has come out of this investigation is that many of the local governments are actively engaging with the heritage policy and encouraging landowners, and in some cases requiring landowners to also get a CHIP associated with any land use process that is intersects with cultural heritage. So we see, really pathways to co-create new models of heritage management, certainly ones that will have a much more active presence and role for nations themselves. But we also saw the real power of engaging place-based responses in terms of local and regional governments and communities in terms of better understanding the heritage management process. The process of relationship building that Dana spoke about is extraordinarily important, and I would imagine led to the most powerful changes changes of mind, changes of policy, changes of behavior that we witness throughout the projects. And all levels of government can work to better understand Indigenous cultural heritage, but become allies in the process of management. So with that, I'll turn it back to Dana, and then we'll carry on.
Thank you, Sean. I can always listen to you forever. Yes, so I think you guys, hopefully the audience is getting a good idea of kind of how the different arms of the project presented so far dovetail. And I'll turn it over to Kim shortly to tie it all together. But just want to drive this point home again, that archaeology can be seen as an agent of social change, that we can think about it. I tell my students to never squander the privilege of being an archaeologist, that it's your right and responsibility, it's your responsibility to actually use this privilege of studying archaeology to create social change in a better way. This is I just want to highlight a couple of the outreach events. I said there were many, but these are the most recent, so it's big in my heart. This was an unveiling of a welcome mural installation that had a plaque and mural on the dock of Lasqueti, co-created by settler artists Sophia Rosenberg, Julia Woldmo, and Coast Salish artist Jesse Rocalma, and the plaque created by Ocean Highland. And this is all based on the archaeology and the oral tradition and on our knowledge of Xwe'etay. And you see it way out to sea, just like you would have seen the settlement in the day. And here we have this beautiful gathering. You can see everybody in the upper right. People came from upper left, excuse me. People came from all over to witness this and to embrace it. And it was really, really a celebration. And that's Kim blessing the plaques with eagle down. It was extraordinarily powerful. And thank you, Kim. In addition to the opening of the unveiling of the mural, we also opened a traveling exhibit, which I encourage all of you to try to get into your own communities. It's been a year and a half at Ingenia Museum in Ottawa, and now there's a traveling exhibit version, which actually highlights Indigenous presence on Xwe'etay as seen through community and through the archaeological record. And yeah, it's being snatched up. It's really quite exciting. And I just want to end my portion before I turn it over to Kim with a video from this traveling exhibit that gives you a kind of visceral sense of the beauty of this place and the heritage that is embedded on the landscape. Oh, no, not yet. There's actually a very cool project that we're doing too with archives and stuff like that, but I'm not going to tell you about it now because this big build up to the video. So here you go. And now I'd actually just would like to take a moment and turn this over to introduce Kim before I turn it over to her. I told you that that this is a broad-based project, and we have lots of mentors and people who have guided us through. But really, Kim, it's hard to explain the depth of what Kim has given us, and taken this project to something that could have been just stumbling along to something that was really much more profound, at huge cost to herself, representing her brother Mark Rakalma, the hereditary chief, whose territory includes Xwe'etay. Together they have guided us and nurtured us and taught us that the way forward is to let go of shame and to guilt, but to open our hearts. And Kim, we love you and are very grateful. And I thank you for joining us. I turn it to you.
Lakesla, thank you so kindly for that. I'm beyond emotional having heard the remnants of my people's past being validated in a way that I don't think people understand can know how that feels. There was a time in British Columbia's history, and I need to fill this in because there are a few themes that I was listening to that need to be flushed out so you understand some of this. There was less than a 50-year period where the land, the people, the children, and the culture were lost. They were outlawed and lost. And I say lost rather than diminished because we're still in that place ourselves of reclaiming and remembering in a good way. The virgin soil diseases took Xwe'etay. There was almost a century of maritime fur traders that were up and down that corridor. And the populations of most of our peoples, but in particular, the northern Coast Salish, the Pendlish people, were diminished from a dozen villages to less than 200 people in two mixed communities of Comox and Qualicum today. And the rapid depopulation from the vast population on Xwe'etay to nothing in the 1870s was not. 1870s was when the reserves were designated. So the movement stopped at that time in a quite, not stop, but very, very, there was such a decline. So you will see that on the record because there was only 5% of the Indigenous land was left. So people were not able to move. And at that time, that was on the heels of losing, some would say 80 or 90% of our population during that part of the century. It is a really small part of our history, but it is a devastating part. It really represents, a really tiny amount of our history over the millennia, but it still has reverberating effects. And as we work with this project, I remember speaking with my brother, kept him informed, but I was in a mourning process from that I kind of had very strict laws to follow for my late husband. So I wasn't able to come out publicly to do a lot of work. And at one point, it was important, we were talking about how things were moving. When we know the population, we've spent time there. Mark fished there. He camped there with his children. Our grandparents did the same. Our uncles, our great uncles, great grandparents did the same and reminded us we had to remember these places. But we also understood that there was great opposition because we're fishermen. We know that. We hear it. We hear it on the wind. And so it was decided that the cultural mafia had to move in and try to lend a hand. Because this isn't just a project that the university was conducting and individual professors were conducting. This was something that would validate and honor our ancestors who had been forgotten for almost 2 centuries. Last month, I opened an art exhibit. This isn't a sidebar. This is explaining why this is important. I opened an exhibit for my late husband's nephew, Cecil Dawson, in Port Alberni, and he called it Two Worlds Colliding. And he dedicated it to all those that were lost during that century. From the rapid depopulation, we still have reverberations from losing that many people that quickly, and then losing the land, and then the children being taken away. All the children started to be taken away in about the 1880s, and right up until the 1990s. 76 was when the last one was closed in Port Alberni. We're talking not very long ago, within our lifetime. And anything to actually do that you could do legally to protect yourself was outlawed until my lifetime. I was born during my lifetime when that was still in place. So we're talking about policy changes, but you still have people alive who lived in this oppression, with this oppression. And I say often, you can change laws, but you can't change how people's mindsets. You can't change the systemic racism that has been part of Canadian history easily. And that's why this was a really important project to be part of, because you have an incredible microcosm on Lasqueti, where people have chosen to live often an alternate lifestyle and live more gently on the land, a small population, and it's contained. So you're able to deal with this outside of a lot of the regulatory stuff that you deal with on other islands and all. Yeah, it's not to say that you don't have issues and problems, but it's a little more containable. And I doubt that this project could work anywhere else to the degree that it has there, for lots of reasons. Resident archaeologists, lots of interpersonal connections prior to this with the original owners of the land, et cetera, et cetera. And all of this is poignant. I've served as an elected chief, so I'm aware of how hard it is to do this work. My first job was with the archaeology department in the mid-70s in Victoria, mapping out and casting all the petroglyphs on Vancouver Island and finding some new ones, and listening to but my most important job that year was listing all the hereditary owners of the land, not the elected owners, but the hereditary owners of the land, and speaking to each and every one of them, asking permission to put their contact information down. And so from the mid-1970s, and I don't know if it still happens today, there was a common practice to not just look at the Indian Act chiefs and councils, but also to look at that other structure that is available, which are the hereditary, whatever they're called, Hatwith, Tsiam, Gigi Khmer chiefs. Chief is it's a terminology that belongs to colonial time. And it's not what we would say. Actually, when I was an elected chief, I never called myself that because I was allowed to. It wasn't a way that I was allowed to do that and step over that. But there's another designation of governance that has been forgotten about with all of this. And because of the rapid depopulation and all of the residential school issues, let me plug in. I've got low battery, it just told me. Because of all of that, it was really, really important to understand that our communities aren't intact either, which is why the cultural mafia came, Dana, because we had to bring the culturally intact people to you in order to do, I listened in the beginning and I saw and I heard in the background that there was division. And I think what's more important than talking about the lofty ideas is to really, really just get down to the basics of answering basic questions about history. Try to dispel things that people don't understand. And as I often say, look for those threads of connection that we all have so that we have commonality somewhere, so we can open the lines of communication so that we're not constantly in an us and a them situation or living in a guilt situation or a blame situation. So dispelling all of that is vastly important to make any of these projects work, because you're coming with people who are on a political side posturing for treaty, for whatever political needs there are for the day. And what happens is the ancestors are often forgotten. There is a need to do that. Nations connections, you were saying there are 14 nations who have connections to Xwe'etay. And that's a really broad statement that needs to, when you're doing your planning, really define deeper. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of land use studies that have been done in preparation of treaties, almost all by white men. Excuse me for being gender kind of nasty, but often it's done by legal teams. Having land use does not declare ownership. So understanding those nuances is really important because you can offend people so easily. Our people married very carefully. We continue to do so today to share resources, but that doesn't mean the ownership is shared. The stewardship and those obligations always stay with the traditional owners, which really is, I would have to say, the ones who have the stewardship and the obligations. That's what's more important. And to this day, my brother's still contacted by traditional people whenever Sabine Channel is open for commercial fishery or for food fish purposes. He's asked permission first, as we do of other people, before we go into their territories, even on commercial ventures. So that layer is missing from some of the policy stuff because it isn't as clearly defined. And it's also difficult to navigate the issues of the jurisdiction. The federal jurisdiction of an Indian Act band council is actually above RDN and somewhere in lines with what the provincial jurisdiction is. It hasn't been afforded the same weight in many things, but legally it's in that. So just understanding those various layers is superbly important. So the way that people are connected is important to define, but to understand. It doesn't mean that people are going to claim ownership and take the land away. It just means that for ancestral reasons. I'll get back to opening my nephew's art exhibit because I think this is important. He wanted to honor all of those who were lost during that time of first contact, from virgin soil diseases, from scuffles with the Hudson's Bay Company and the proprietorial governances, the colonial governances processes. And there were scuffles that were not always openly, we don't openly know about it, but maybe read Robin Fisher's Contact and Conflict, and he actually documents some that were not very well known. But what he did was kind of magical. He took maritime maps and he overlaid them with paintings of every animal from the undersea kingdom, every creature from the undersea kingdom, in the place where they originated, within our Nuyams, within our Gilgalis. That's our origin stories, our places that informed us of how to look after the land. And so he made those connections so that the colonial maps and the newly informed ways of mapping systems were not always just blurred and in the background. But he'll put the undersea wolf the sea wolf on top. The undersea kingdom, all the undersea kingdom, the kulus, the thunderbird, the eagle, sea eagle, all of them, octopus, all of them. And it's quite stunning. It's a stunning story, but it's an acknowledgement that until we deal with that time in our lives, mostly the ancestors, which is why traditionally we had to begin with honoring the ancestors so that they would be fed. We all, from all of the cultures up and down the coast, we have a form of burning and feeding the ancestors. It's different in each of the cultures, but there are ways to do that. And so before large projects like this takes place, it's imperative that people are able to have a lot of information about that intersection historically, but also honor the ancestors so that things don't, as Adam would say, things don't go wrong. It's not dangerous. That way, it's no different than starting something with a prayer. You're sending intention. You're doing it. You help people to do things with intention. It's the same as quietly, if you see traditional people working on this part of the coast, they will quietly tuck kachameen seed, wild celery seed in their mouth because that feeds the ancestors. It honors the ancestors. And so it's a protection measure. So be familiar with those kinds of things. It takes you to a completely different place. Doesn't mean you need to be Indigenous and do as. Just be cautious and know how that, if there is local knowledge of how this respect is done, then follow that. And it's not all the same. It's not one size fits all. I was happy to see the clamshells. Waxy Stella, my late husband, showed me on many, we surveyed hundreds of beaches with the clam gardens over the last 25 years. And he said we would take the clamshells and crush them and put them at the foot of each of our houses for two reasons. One, when the moon was full, it would illuminate and light. It would be like a street light. It would illuminate and reflect and make the area brighter. And you probably see that at night. And the other was, it was a defense mechanism so that you would hear the crunching as the invaders were coming in. And so each of the larger village sites always, especially where the chieftain houses were, all had that pathway. He always looked for that when we were mapping clam gardens. He looked for those strips of carefully placed clamshells to show not only that it was a significant village, but that it actually showed some rank as well. The other was 20 years ago, we were mapping in an area around Quadra Island, Granite Bay, up Phillips Arm, about 400 clam gardens with a geomorphologist, John Harper. And Nancy Turner and I quietly got off the boat, and Adam had said to me, Quackwalla, go check and see three things. He wants to see if they're crab apples. He wanted to see if there was atzayum, which is eelgrass in the front, in the water, and he wanted to see if there was specifically singing nettle and rose. And even if the village had not been, or the area had not been used as a fish camp or a seasonal round place to live, those old crabapple trees and the stinging nettle placed in rows would still be there. So Nancy and I went off, and I believe it was about 150 plus sites that we mapped. And each one of them, she was just beaming, ethnobotanist Nancy Turner. She was so excited. And I believe that's when we started to look really clearly at not just looking at the physical features of a clam garden, because those weren't understood until Waxy Stella explained how they worked. But he said, if this was truly a place where people one of the members of a clan lived, one of the extended family members lived, because people would have their own, the families would have their own little island sites. You would find the clam gardens, which would only be harvested till March. Then they were left to rest, to spawn. We'd go back if there was a YM gillies and the harvest hadn't been good or something had happened to the salmon, the fall salmon fishery. We'd have to go back in and take clams, but we always let them rest after they spawned themselves and reproduced. But they'd come back in the fall to harvest stingy nettles, come back in the fall to harvest crab apples, but come back in May to harvest Xwe'etay, the roots, the rhizome of the eelgrass. And usually when they're harvesting that, you will always see little piles of weights, rocks with holes in them. And that always told us there was a halibut hole. And sometimes other bottom fish would be harvested as well, but always in amongst the eelgrass would be places that halibut would have been harvested near the shore in May. So we knew that those clam gardens were lived in from around November, December until March, moving out then to collect and harvest other things in Ooligans, usually for us in late March and April, and then back in May to the same place where the clams were to harvest the Xwe'etay, because it's only, and seaweed. It's only like a window of 2 weeks that you can harvest those things, and the whitefish. And the whitefish would have been sun-dried and then back again out to do berry picking, and then back again in the fall to harvest the stinging nettle to make rope. But the nettles were harvested in the springtime to eat, just the tops. But the rope was made all winter long. So you'd harvest stalks and stalks and stalks and put them away to make the stinging nettle ropes. So that and crab apples were preserved for the winter months. So archaeology is so tied to seasonal rounds, and to understand seasonal rounds in each of the areas so that you can, all of that information recreates the past, things that we have been told through oral traditions. But I need to be really clear that not all old Indians are knowledge holders or elders. We've lost a lot of knowledge, and it's only a really select few who were able to carry this on that weren't affected by the rapid depopulation and the residential schools, so that carries on. So please be discerning when you're asking chiefs and councils and also quote unquote old people for information. It's no different than, I remember saying once in a class in university when I was asked some really pointed questions, I said, I can actually answer those questions, but I'd like to know about the demographics of women. And I spewed off a whole bunch of things and was criticized because I was hurtful. I was being quite hurtful. But don't expect information. Wait for people. Try to wait for people to identify knowledge holders for you, larger groups of people. And I think it's important for you to work hard to understand that there is that other layer. I had a couple of little notes. Yeah, it is hiding in plain sight. We are hiding in plain sight. And the more that these kinds of studies take place, Dana, the more people are going to be looking, not just at the clam gardens, but at the fish weirs and also the old prairies and gardens, the camas fields, and all of the above. It's really important to look beyond and to perhaps build a structure so that people can see the seasonal round before you even begin this investigation, so that you would be able to know what kind of tools you're looking for, the spaces and places that you'd be looking, even things like those platforms of shell. It's interesting. nothing was ever built on them. It was built above them so that they would be a defense mechanism. This is invaluable information, and it's emotional to know our ancestors are resting in a respectful place now and that they are remembered in a good way. We can't fix everything from the past. We cannot fix even what we're doing now. But I think if we move forward with committing ourselves to understanding and hearing the information that's coming forward and not using the same colonial tools to impose them on governance structures that are foreign to our people. Remember those layers that are important, to not just try to make them check boxes. Reconciliation isn't checking a box. It's actually a journey. It's a journey, and it is a relationship. And the prime example of that is Xwe'etay, our most highly trained cultural clan chief of our nation, attended your son's bar mitzvah, offered a blessing because your son and he made a connection. And he saw that our teachings were very similar. So he was honored to do that. Those relationship buildings are why it was easy to come there. People don't understand that it isn't just a given because you have a meeting. Those relationships take years to develop. So I thank you for that. And I think I'll leave it there. I'll wait to hear some information and answer some questions that might be more useful. Thank you. I appreciate very much both what you and Sean have put together. I need to plug in, so excuse me for my head ducking down.
Thank you so much, Kim. Wow, my heart, my mind are full. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Sean. I've, been frantically writing down notes for my own sake, but I do want to make sure that we've got some time for some questions that have come in. And so if that's all right, we'll jump right in. The first question we've got, and I'll just leave it open to the three of you to sort of jump in, whoever wants to speak. And I'm sure you work so collaboratively that you'll jump in and support one another in your answers. This is a big question. What can individuals and communities do to support First Nations heritage protection? So, not necessarily every community is going to have a project like the one that you've been sharing with us tonight, but what are some kind of direct actions that people in communities can take?
I would say quickly, and I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in. I would say get to know your community. Get to know the people, the Indigenous people in the community around you, and not just the elected leadership. Ask those questions really carefully of, are there active cultural workers or hereditary people or knowledge holders? Knowledge holders are a really good way to put that could help guide this. Because not all elders and not all people who sit on elected chiefs and councils can offer that. Because I don't know if you know this, but you don't even have to be Indigenous or a Canadian citizen in order to qualify to be an elected chief. And so that is just a cautionary note. So be very cautious, but be respectful. Be really respectful. Take a look and see how each nation presents itself on social media. You may have some ideas, and you might do a little bit of research and see who's who, but get to know the people. If you don't know that by now, you've got some serious work to do. If you're working in an area, region, and you don't know the major players, you've got a lot of homework to do. And guess what? It'll benefit you to do that in the long run. Does that help?
I would add just kind of just much more narrowly from the archaeology perspective. One, make sure you get that traveling exhibit in your community.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep, it's intended for communities as again a way to spark conversation, and I would say, um, you know, spend a couple $100 and bring an archaeologist into your community to give a talk and to start training locals to start seeing with archaeology eyes. That is a fundamental thing you can do. You can learn to read the landscape. It's not rocket science because, as Sean says, once you see it, you can't unsee it. That alone would help protect the archaeological heritage. And again, if you think of that as a conduit of then honoring all of Indigenous history, past, present, and future.
It might be really wise for us to really think about developing a bit of a reading list as well. And there have been some interesting papers that have come about intersecting, how to intersect in these areas. And even the paper that Bill White wrote for you about the backgrounder on burning for the ancestors, it might be really wise to have and to begin a resource library that has some pretty authentic and interesting voices that would help to demystify some of the things that I find that people come with a lot of fear, and they're so afraid to take those first steps. And anything that we can do, you can do, they can do to try to minimize that fear makes it much easier to learn.
I love the start to your answer, Kim, around the relationship building. I think that's really, really key and has been so powerful in this project. Thank you for the question as well. That's definitely sort of the big the big question, right? In terms of why we're sort of seeking to mobilize all of this information and knowledge and share these stories. From the planning side is that, there are set processes and timelines associated with things like official community plans, where planners will be reaching out and consulting with landowners and communities. And those are opportunities to bring the knowledge that you gain through the relationships, through the archaeology that Dana's talking about, and build statements of intent and bylaws into those processes to honor and seek to protect Indigenous cultural heritage. So while we spoke about sort of that separation, that jurisdictional separation, and Kim added just a really beautiful layer of understanding to that as well. There are, even within the limited processes that we have now, places where that knowledge can be shared and intent can be stated about communities and their vision for what a future for their communities and the land can look like.
I saw a question on the question board. Did you see that?
Yeah, we are tracking them here. Thank you. And Sean, just because you've touched on the planning side of things, I'll ask you a follow-up question that's come in, and it's sort of a two-parter. How can local government planning departments support the work of decolonizing planning? And then very specifically in places where there's no or minimal development permit areas, is it possible to retrofit, or might you have another recommendation?
Wow.
Yeah, those are big questions. I actually, kudos to the planning profession. They've been doing a lot of work over particularly the last 6 years in terms of trying to decolonize practice, build an understanding of the harms of the past and harms of planning practice, and chart a better pathway forward, working with nations and working with Indigenous knowledge holders. So there has been a lot of work there. We saw that a real willingness to engage meaningfully in decolonization processes and reconciliation processes. Reconciliation more than decolonization. Decolonization will involve much harder questions around land and things like that. But definitely reconciliation, and all of the local governments, for example, that were included in that heritage policy example, have statements of reconciliation. But where those statements were not necessarily supported by really robust processes to educate and inform, municipal staff and planners about Indigenous heritage, simply because it hasn't been within their wheelhouse, it hasn't been within their jurisdiction. So that was really the meaningful steps that we saw, where planners were taking it upon themselves to educate themselves, reaching out to surrounding nations to ask questions and to understand the Indigenous context and layered context in which they're operating. So that, I think, is just going to be an ongoing process, both as a profession as a community practice to incorporate better understandings of Indigenous planning and Indigenous knowledge, but also relationship building and education. So yeah, and what was there was a second part. Sorry, I should have written it down.
No, it's very specific. It's talking around development permit areas.
Right.
And so
right.
for areas where there aren't development permit areas or they're very minimal, what would you suggest? The specific question, is it possible to retrofit?
Wow. Okay. So, Sean, correct me if I don't have a lot of knowledge in this area, but does the RDN have any overarching reach in areas that are not permit areas?
The ARC branch, you mean? I
The
mean,
RDN, do they have jurisdiction to enforce any type of permitting outside of, in areas that don't have permits per se?
yeah, I mean the archaeology policy is clear. It's the same regardless of whether permitting it takes place or not.
Yeah,
So
I think it's thin. I think the archaeology permitting system is very, very thin, and it doesn't really satisfy most of what's needed. But I think it's really important for areas that aren't permitted that the little local governance structures, whether it's through Islands Trust or whether it's through an RDN process, whether it's through a community process, really, really need to adopt and understand and go beyond what the Heritage Conservation Act or whatever it's called today, because I've been operating with that for 30, 40 years now, go beyond since its inception, go beyond what it actually, I think community should really try to go beyond what the permitting structure is in terms of just contacting, because right now you just have to check off a box and send notification that you're going to be disturbing a known site rather than actually do the real consultation. So I think there is a need to have those conversations with these smaller communities and really try to start encouraging that kind of respectful obligation to landowners in even small areas. I know that's going to come with a lot of fight, but we are probably the only developed country that doesn't respect archaeology as other developed countries do. None of what happens in Canada could ever happen in Greece, could ever happen in Italy, could ever happen even in the United States. We are so weak with the Heritage Conservation Act that if we're not following it, we're really in a lot of trouble.
yeah. And I think for building on that, there are mechanisms where even in those jurisdictions without permitting, the local governance structures, the regional governance structures have access to the data around where sites exist. So part of that is sharing that information with landowners, engaging with nations that have their own heritage policy when you're looking at land use development and planning. There are other mechanisms like real estate transactions where purchases of property are supposed to be informed about the presence of archaeological heritage on the site, and that this is not happening, and either by virtue of not wanting to impede a sale, or which would be malicious, or simply out of a lack of understanding. So there are other mechanisms, even when the permitting development permits themselves don't exist, that we could be doing a much better job of trying to build that knowledge base of where sites exist. Yeah.
Not only that, but I really feel like this is the conversation that I've been having ever since our graves were dug up in Deep Bay in the early 2000s. And there's such a lack of education, even now, 25 years later, there's such a lack of education and knowledge with the general population. There needs to be a really large, I think RDNs all around the province need to commit to education of what the Heritage Conservation Act is minimally, and ethically what they should be, especially given UNDRIP and all other kinds of legal obligations the Government of Canada and the British Columbia government have, that it has to go even further than that. So there needs to be, on the municipal level and the RDN level, some big education. And it needs to be probably something that is pushed to, even for getting your real estate license, you need to know about this, not just so know it happens, but test it on it, like a driver's license. I think that education is going to change this mindset that has been systemic. It's going to take something quite large to change this this mindset, because we now fee simple ownership comes with a whole whack of ideals and ideas that aren't in line with the Heritage Conservation Act, and it is quite often people will just dismiss it and not say anything and just do what they want to do rather than honor that. So somehow education needs to come into this at a very high level. We just don't do enough of it.
We've got a clarifying question related to that. Ardith would like to know, what is the difference between development permit areas and heritage conservation areas?
Right. Go ahead, Sean.
Okay.
You're the expert.
We're doing a good tag team on this.
There you go.
I've learned new things about your involvement with these processes in the past as well, which is wonderful. Learn new things, obviously, every time we get to do this, and it's always such an honor. And so the development permit is a really specific sort of local government mechanism where people would apply to alter the land base in some way on their own private property, build something, extend a house, renovate. I live in Vancouver here on the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and I couldn't start digging in my backyard just because I felt like it, right? I need those permits, which then trigger that there is or could be an archaeological site on that piece of property. So it's a very specific mechanism. The conservation areas, the Heritage Act applies to the whole province. So those rules about it being illegal to disturb an Indigenous archaeological site apply everywhere. So the challenge with that, obviously, where there's no triggering mechanism within land use process, that someone is doing something to the land base, in light of the lack of education and knowledge that Kim was just talking about, or sort of just stealth development in places that are more remote, we're obviously losing the heritage at the pace of development, as I talked about earlier.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's been one. And when was the Heritage Conservation Act enacted? Was it 80? Was it 86?
Late 80s, early 90s. Yeah, I think 86. It's like 20 or 30, coming up on 30.
Yeah, I think the first one was 86. Anyway, there hasn't been a charge yet. Not a charge, but I mean, there hasn't been, nobody's been convicted of an offense against the Heritage Conservation Act in BC yet. I tried to do that in 20 years ago, but the RCMP didn't walk the evidence over to Crown Counsel within the 2-year period, so the charges were stayed. Even though I had court recorders and we had full evidence, it was just too much of a political hot potato. So there isn't actually an appetite to do the charges as well. So I think people need to be aware that it is a very thin act, and it doesn't really protect a lot, but it's the only thing we've got. So it needs to be enforced. The little bit that we have needs to be enforced.
We've got another big one on this topic, is how to improve or replace the Heritage Conservation Act and branch.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Go ahead, Sean.
Oh, yeah, I get to start again?
Yeah.
Well, there is as I mentioned, there's a process underway right now called the Heritage Act Transformation Project. It was initiated in 2022, so it's been an ongoing process of 3 phases of consultation. with nations, with archaeologists and heritage managers, with local governments, with academics and researchers, um, it started, which was quite helpful for us with the project, with an articulation of all the problems. Right, they published like a 9 by 12 sheet with table after table after table, 10 font bullet points of all the existing and known problems with the act. So it was I think it's, the government consultation processes you can always critique, but they're 3 years in, and I think moving to a phase in the spring where there'll be a final consultation with proposed amendments to the act, and then we'll see how much of that participation and how much of the Indigenous perspective in terms of nations wanting to exert more control over the management of their own heritage, how that is facilitated through amendments. So the short answer, or the longer answer that it's becoming longer, is we're going to have to kind of wait and see.
Yeah. It's in the works, but I still think that we have such a little, it's not on anybody's radar apart from people who are in the business and Indigenous people who are harmed by it. And I think that one of the biggest things that need to take place is not just change the Heritage Conservation Act so that it is more respectful towards our Indigenous heritage, but have some teeth in it so that people have consequences. Developers have real consequences for digging up a grave. They can. I think it's superbly important that education is hand in hand when when the new act is rolled out. Education is such a big issue around planners, RDM, municipalities. It's hugely important. But more than that, we need to have real teeth within the Heritage Conservation Act so that a little bit of money goes a long way. We now have probably property ownership reaching up in terms of this province of people who were not born here. I'm not an anti-immigration person, but people who do not understand often our history. And so there's a brand new layer here of investment properties that can be developed without a real tie-in to the land and the people or consequences. So we have to be superbly careful about the wording so that there actually is teeth, so that the owners of the lands actually have a consequence for disregarding the ancestral heritage of the land.
Right, Kim, I think your earlier point too about the need for just broader education is really important and linked to this as well, because I think the introduction of that act is going to be a point of real vulnerability for the provincial government.
Yep.
Because that lack of information and that lack of knowledge about why Indigenous heritage is so important is going to be weaponized by active disinformation.
Yep.
So it's undoubtedly something that they're approaching very carefully, and will be a time of vulnerability that I'm sure we'll see start to play out.
Well, we saw it in Xwe'etay. We saw it even in that small population, a real strong opposition to trying to identify what was there in plain sight and what was there under the law now. So we saw that opposition in that small community. We just have to multiply that and see that there is going to be, you're right, there's going to be that opposition and people not understanding the historical past and the legal obligations both the federal and provincial government have to make this happen. They don't realize that this is actually something that's mandated and has to happen.
Thank you. Such an important conversation, and obviously we're not going to get to the answer tonight. I am mindful that we are at 8:35 here, so we're running a little over time, but I see that we've still got almost 40 attendees still with us. So With your permission, I'd like to offer just two more questions that have come in. And this first one, Kim, I think is in reference to one of your comments about the importance of making sure that we're connecting with knowledge keepers and actually, having reliable sources of information. Um, so what would you suggest when someone is providing false or misleading or incomplete information when that is coming from an Indigenous person, specifically when it's information about the land and traditional land use? What might you suggest?
What you'll probably notice with knowledge holders is that they will always identify themselves to the land first. There are little key tells that will help you. Seldom will you hear an awful lot of bragging about who they are and what they own, but will give you references of past experiences that might be helpful for framing the discussion. Real knowledge holders are identified by other people, not by themselves. And so often different organizations like chiefs and councils and different friendship centers, et cetera, would be able to help you identify people. But you can always do a little bit of research, and you'll be able to see if somebody, and I've had people who have kind of inserted themselves, and if they're not really from that area and they're speaking on behalf and they don't have a connection, be wary. There are many people that will self-identify sometimes. So again, just be cautious of the way people present themselves and the knowledge that they're presenting. They really need to be validated by the governance structure of the territory that you're on. Not everybody, we have a lot of people who are actively cultural in my traditional territory who are not from here. And I've managed to track most of them down and say, you can still be who you are and practice your culture, but you can't represent us. So you need to always say, I give thanks. Often I travel across the country and I will always open, no matter where I am, Winnipeg, Saskatchewan, Whitehorse. I will always open by saying I rose at sunrise and introduced myself to the ancestors of this land. And I give thanks for being allowed to be here to do this work. That typically is your way of knowing somebody is something like that, will inform you of that. That's a tell that will help you to understand if you have somebody there or somebody who wants to self-identify. People get excited sometimes with what they know, but they're not really licensed to do this work.
Thank you so
I hope
much.
it helps. It's complex. It's complex for us too. Yeah.
Absolutely. One more question here. What should someone do if they think they've come across an archaeologically site, a culturally, a culturally sensitive archaeological site?
We'll turn it right back to Sean.
And I'm going to ping it over to Dana.
Good. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, legally you're supposed to, call the archaeology branch, but I would say publicly here now that what you should do is actually call the nearest local nation. It's probably in their core territory, so just by proximity. Then, as Kim said, it's tricky to figure out who to call, who to talk to, what nation to talk to. But as a starting place, I would look to the nation whose office, that's the elected office, is close, if you have no other connection to hereditary leadership.
Yeah, I would say do it simultaneously. I would say call the archaeology branch and the nation simultaneously because both have obligations. And the band offices should be able to defer you to somebody who is working in those areas, not always, but should be able to. But if the archaeology branch knows that you've already contacted, sometimes it expedites the process. But legally, you have to call the archaeology branch. Ethically, and I would say legally as well, given the international laws that Canada and British Columbia have adopted, you have to call the nation as well.
Thank you for that. Well, I'm really glad that we were able to get through the questions that have come in. Thank you to those of you who asked them. I really want to thank everyone for joining us this evening, and a very special thanks to Kim, Sean, and Dana for sharing your time, your expertise, your stories with us. Been a really rich evening. And again, tell your friends and neighbors, this has been recorded. So for folks who wanted to be with us this evening and couldn't, we will post the recording on our website, the Stewardship Education Program website of the Islands Trust. I also just want to quickly invite everyone to join us for our next in the Stewardship Education series. We will be having a presentation on species at risk and how to become a nature steward. So some really practical tips there from our biologists with the Islands Trust Conservancy, as well as featuring some of the work happening on Gabriola Island around stewardship protection there. And that's happening on November 19th at 7 p.m. Unless there are any last comments for our beautiful panel, I would just like to thank everyone again for coming, and we hope to see you at a future webinar. Thank you so much and good
Thanks,
evening.
everyone. Really
Thank-
appreciate you spending time with us this evening.
Yeah. Thank you, especially those who stayed late. Thank you for the great questions.
Mhm.
Hala Kessler.